On the night of April 12, 1945, a woman named Bess Truman was called into the White House and told, without much warning, that her husband was about to become the most powerful man on earth. She did not cry. She did not smile. She asked one question: was there anything she could do? Eleanor Roosevelt told her no, and then asked if there was anything she could do for Bess. Bess said, quietly, "Is the president dead?" It was the only thing that made the moment real to her. Her husband had gone from a senator nobody outside Missouri could pick out of a lineup, to vice president for 82 days, to the man who would decide whether to drop an atomic bomb on Japan. And the woman standing next to him had spent the better part of 3 decades trying to talk him out of a career in politics altogether. That is the strange center of this story. Harry Truman became president almost by accident, dropped into the job in the middle of a world war, with almost no preparation. But Bess Truman's discomfort with politics was not an accident at all. It went back 40 years, to a gunshot in a bathroom on North Delaware Street in Independence, Missouri, and it never fully left her. She spent her entire adult life next to a man who loved political combat the way some men love fishing, and she spent that same life, quietly, stubbornly, wishing he had picked something else. She married him anyway. She campaigned for him anyway, dragging herself onto train platforms and county fairgrounds long after she'd decided she hated every minute of it. She sat 2 feet away from him while he made a decision that killed over 100,000 people, and she was furious he hadn't asked her opinion first. And when reporters tried to get inside her head, to find out what the woman behind Harry Truman actually thought about anything, she gave them almost nothing. One press conference, a handful of index cards with the word "no" written next to most of the follow-up questions history has bothered to ask. This is not a story about a political wife who loved the spotlight and thrived in it. It's the opposite one. It's about what happens when someone spends 53 years standing next to the exact life they never wanted, and does it so well that almost nobody, at the time, realized how much she resented it. Before we get into how a shy girl from a Missouri finishing school ended up in the Oval Office against her own wishes, hit subscribe. This channel goes deep into the marriages behind the presidents and the first families most people only know from textbook photographs, the real arguments, the real letters, the parts that never made it into the official portrait. If that's your kind of history, you're in the right place. Now, back to Independence, Missouri. In the winter of 1885, Elizabeth Virginia Wallace was born on February 13, 1885, in Independence, Missouri, the oldest of 4 children and the only daughter. Her family was, by local standards, close to royalty. The Wallaces and the Gateses were 2 of the wealthiest, most established families in town, and Bess grew up in a large Victorian house that made clear, without anyone needing to say it, exactly where the family stood. She was tall for a girl of her era, athletic, good at tennis and horseback riding, and by most accounts, unusually confident for someone who would later spend her life avoiding attention. She played baseball with the boys in the neighborhood. One of those boys was a farm kid named Harry Truman. They met as children at Sunday school, and Harry, by his own later account, was finished the moment he saw her. Golden curls, blue eyes he never stopped mentioning, even decades later in letters written from Army training camps and Senate cloakrooms. A cousin of the family once said, "There was never any other girl in the world for him, and there is no real evidence that was an exaggeration." What's less remembered is that Bess did not feel the same immediate pull. For years, she considered Harry Truman a friend from school, nothing more, while he quietly rearranged his entire adolescence around getting her attention. The image of Bess Truman as steady and unshakable, the one that would define her decades later, has an origin point that's much darker than most retellings let on. Her father, David Willock Wallace, was a local political figure, well-liked, sociable, and increasingly trapped by debt and by a series of minor government jobs that never paid enough to support his wife and 5 children in the style the family was used to. He started drinking. The drinking got worse. On the morning of June 17, 1903, when Bess was 18 years old, David Wallace walked into the bathroom of the family home and shot himself. Bess was the one who heard it happen. The family's response was to close ranks immediately and permanently. The official cause of death listed for the public was heart disease. Nobody in Independence was fooled, not really, but nobody said the word suicide out loud either, and that silence became the model for how Bess would handle almost everything difficult for the rest of her life. She did not talk about her father's death. She rarely talked about her father at all. What she developed instead was an almost physical aversion to public scrutiny, a conviction that the family's business belonged inside the family, and a deep, permanent suspicion of anyone in politics, because politics, in her mind, had helped grind her father down before he ever picked up the gun. Keep that detail in your head, because it explains almost everything that follows. When Bess Truman spent the next 50 years refusing press conferences and keeping her opinions off the record, historians would sometimes frame it as shyness or old-fashioned modesty. It wasn't only that. It was a woman who had watched what public failure and public exposure did to the man she loved most as a child, and who decided, at 18, that she would never let it happen to her own family if she could help it. The years right after her father's death were quiet ones, at least on the surface. The family moved to Colorado for a stretch so her mother could recover from the shock, then came back to Independence and slid, as much as possible, back into the rhythms of small-town Missouri life. Bess played the part of a normal young woman with real skill. She swam, played tennis well enough to compete, and rode horses with a confidence that made her something of a local standout among the girls her age. None of that athleticism or poise was an act, but underneath it sat a household that had learned, almost overnight, how to talk around the thing that had actually happened, and Bess absorbed that lesson more completely than either of her brothers did. After her father's death, the family moved briefly to Colorado Springs so her mother could recover, and Bess was sent to finishing school at the Barstow School in Kansas City, an institution built to turn young women into proper wives for prominent men. She excelled there. She came home polished, capable, and still, as far as Harry Truman was concerned, completely unattainable, since the Wallaces occupied a social tier well above a struggling farm family from Grandview. Their actual courtship didn't get moving until 1910, when Harry, by his own account, invented an excuse to return a cake plate to the Wallace household just so he could see her again. From there, it dragged and dragged. Harry proposed for the first time in 1911. Bess turned him down. He kept writing to her anyway, for years, hundreds of letters, some of them almost daily, chronicling failed farming attempts, a stint speculating on Oklahoma zinc mines, and an increasingly desperate hope that he might someday have enough money and enough standing to be considered a real match for her. What's easy to miss, watching this from a century away, is that Bess wasn't just playing hard to get. She had genuine, practical reservations, and one of the biggest ones was politics. Her own father's failed political career, patronage jobs that never paid, public embarrassment, alcohol, and finally suicide, sat in the back of her mind every time Harry mentioned wanting to run for office someday. She had already watched one man's political ambitions destroy a household. She was in no hurry to sign up for a second round. World War I changed the math. Harry enlisted, trained as an artillery officer, and shipped out to France in 1918 to command Battery D, a unit known around Kansas City for being nearly unmanageable before he took charge of it. The war did two things to their relationship. It forced a formal engagement in 1917, since Harry wanted something settled before he risked not coming home. And it produced a flood of correspondence. Over 1,300 letters survived between them across their life together, that let Bess see a version of Harry more serious and more capable than the failed farmer and mine speculator she'd known before. He came back from France in 1919 with a combat record, a promotion, and, for the first time, something resembling financial and personal stability. They married on June 28, 1919, at Trinity Episcopal Church in Independence. Bess was 34. considered by the standards of the time to be marrying quite late. Harry was 35. It had taken 9 years from the first proposal. Married life started with an actual business, not a political campaign, and for a moment it looked like Bess might get the life she'd have preferred. Harry opened a haberdashery in downtown Kansas City with an old Army friend, Eddie Jacobson, selling shirts, ties, and hats to the post-war crowd. Business was strong for about 2 years. Then the post-war agricultural recession hit the Midwest hard, credit dried up, and by 1922 the store was bankrupt. Harry spent years afterward paying off the debt rather than declaring it away, a detail that mattered enormously to his later reputation for honesty, but in the moment, it just meant the young couple had lost their only source of independent income. That same year, 1922, Harry Truman entered politics. And here's the detail almost every source agrees on, and almost every retelling underplays. He did it despite his wife's misgivings about politicians, not with her enthusiastic blessing. Despite her objections, he ran for judge of the Jackson County Court, an administrative rather than judicial post, with the backing of the Pendergast political machine, the corrupt but powerful Democratic organization that controlled Kansas City. Bess, who had grown up believing political involvement had helped kill her father, watched her husband climb into bed with the exact kind of machine politics she distrusted most, because it was, practically speaking, the only path available to him. She did not walk away. She did something more complicated. She went along, reluctantly, and started making herself useful, because if this was going to be the family's life, she intended to have some control over how it went. She worked in Harry's Jackson County office as an unpaid assistant, helped him prepare correspondence, and increasingly functioned as an actual political advisor rather than a decorative spouse. Harry would later say she earned every cent he paid her, which was a joke, because for years he didn't pay her anything at all. It was volunteer labor for a career she hadn't wanted her husband to pursue in the first place. The Pendergast machine itself deserves a beat here, because it wasn't a minor detail Bess could ignore or explain away. Tom Pendergast ran Kansas City through patronage, kickbacks, and vote fraud on a scale that eventually landed him in federal prison for tax evasion. Harry Truman's reputation, both at the time and for decades afterward, carried an asterisk because of it. An honest man who owed his early career to a corrupt boss. Bess understood exactly what that association cost the family's standing among the same independent social circles she'd grown up in. She had married into old money and respectability. Her husband's path to any kind of income and any kind of career now ran directly through the sort of political machine her father's generation had warned against. She swallowed that too. In 1924, after a string of miscarriages that were rarely discussed publicly and clearly weighed on both of them, Bess gave birth to their only child, Margaret. She was 39. It was, by any standard, a difficult and dangerous pregnancy for the era, and it produced the one relationship in Bess's life that she guarded even more fiercely than her own privacy. Harry's political career kept climbing through the Pendergast machine, from county judge to presiding judge of the county court, and by 1934, the machine had decided to back him for the United States Senate. He won. In January 1935, the Trumans packed up and moved to Washington, D.C., a city Bess had absolutely no interest in living in. For the next 18 years, with only a brief interruption, Bess Truman's life would be split between two places she felt very differently about. Washington was Harry's world, full of long Senate sessions, committee work, and eventually the vice presidency. Independence was hers, the house on Delaware Street where her mother still lived, where Bess had grown up, where she felt she could actually breathe. The pattern that emerged was almost seasonal, January through June in Washington, June through December back in Missouri with her mother, and, for a stretch, with Margaret in tow for schooling. It was, by Bess's own account and by her daughter's later writing, hard on the family. Harry, working himself into exhaustion in Washington, resented the separations even as he understood why Bess needed them. Margaret, caught in the middle, experienced her mother during the difficult stretches as a strict disciplinarian, and it took years for that relationship to soften. Washington, in the 1930s, was smaller and more Southern in character than it is now, and Bess did eventually build something like a life there. She formed real friendships with other senators' wives, joined the Congressional Wives social circuit she'd once have avoided on principle, and even developed a rapport with Eleanor Roosevelt, then First Lady, that helped ease her into the city's rhythms. It's worth noting that this happened gradually and against her own instincts, not because Washington won her over in some sweeping way, but because she made a practical decision to stop fighting the parts of the job that weren't actually negotiable. Inside the marriage, though, something more important was happening. Harry began writing to Bess constantly whenever they were apart, and increasingly, those letters weren't romantic filler, they were policy discussions. He walked her through committee fights, defense spending investigations, and the internal maneuvering of Senate politics as though she were a colleague rather than a spouse waiting at home. During World War II, Harry chaired a special Senate committee investigating waste and fraud in military spending, work that built his national reputation and eventually put him on Franklin Roosevelt's radar as a running mate. Bess was consulted on almost all of it, even from 400 miles away in Independence. She had never wanted this career for him, but by the early 1940s, she had become, in every practical sense, one of his closest political advisors. If you're finding this as interesting as I do, take a second and hit that like button. It genuinely helps this video reach more people who'd enjoy it. And if you want the story of another political wife who never asked for the spotlight, I've got a whole series on the women standing just off camera from the men history remembers. Check the description. Now, 1944, and the phone call that changed everything. In the summer of 1944, Franklin Roosevelt's party leadership decided his sitting vice president, Henry Wallace, was too controversial to keep on the ticket for a fourth term, and they went looking for a replacement who could unify the party without alarming anyone. Harry Truman, a well-regarded senator with a reputation for honesty and a low national profile, fit the bill. Bess was, by multiple accounts, apprehensive about the nomination from the start. Roosevelt's health was visibly failing, even if the public wasn't told the full extent of it, and Bess understood exactly what a vice presidency under a dying president actually meant. She wasn't wrong to worry. Roosevelt and Truman won in November 1944. Truman was sworn in as vice president in January 1945. He held the office for 82 days, during which Roosevelt barely spoke to him and never briefed him on the atomic bomb program or the state of the war's endgame. Then, on the evening of April 12, 1945, Truman was summoned to the White House and told the president was dead. This is the moment we opened on. Bess Truman had spent over 20 years quietly hoping her husband's political career would stay at a level where their private life remained, mostly private. Instead, at 59 years old, she found herself First Lady of the United States, with essentially no warning and no preparation, in the closing months of the deadliest war in human history. She did not want the role, and she made almost no attempt to disguise that fact from the people closest to her. Where Eleanor Roosevelt had held regular press conferences for women reporters, traveled constantly, and used the position as a platform for activism, Bess held exactly one press conference in her entire tenure, and used it mainly to establish that she would not be answering many further questions. She handed out a printed card to reporters who tried to interview her, with pre-written responses to the questions she anticipated, most of them a polite version of no comment. Her stated philosophy, repeated by biographers and family members alike, was blunt. A woman's place in public was to sit beside her husband, stay quiet, and make sure her hat was on straight. It sounds almost like satire today. She meant it completely. Behind that public silence, though, was a woman who had more real influence over presidential decision-making than almost anyone in the country understood. Harry consulted her on major decisions as a matter of habit, not performance. He called her, privately and repeatedly, the boss, and it wasn't only affectionate shorthand. Margaret later wrote, that Bess had functioned, for most of the marriage, as a full partner in Harry's political life, someone whose judgment he trusted more than almost anyone else's. Which makes what happened in August 1945 sting more than it might otherwise. Truman made the decision to drop atomic bombs on Hiroshima and then Nagasaki without consulting Bess first. When she found out, she was furious, not primarily about the moral weight of the decision, but about being cut out of it. Margaret later described her mother as feeling like a spectator rather than a partner in her husband's presidency for the first time, and said it made her genuinely angry. It's a small human detail buried inside one of the largest decisions of the 20th century. The woman who had spent 2 decades helping her husband think through political choices was upset that on the biggest one of his life, he hadn't picked up the phone. The White House the Trumans moved into was, quite literally, collapsing. Structural engineers brought in during the late 1940s found the building was suffering from more than a century of patched repairs, added weight from new technology, and expanded floors, and foundations that were never built for the load. In 1948, the residence was declared unsafe for continued occupancy. One frequently repeated detail from the period has Margaret's piano leg breaking partway through the floor of her sitting room, a small, almost comic illustration of a much larger problem. The family relocated across the street to Blair House, while the entire interior of the White House was gutted and rebuilt between 1949 and 1952, a project now generally called the Truman Reconstruction. Bess, oddly, found something closer to purpose in this crisis than she had in almost any other part of the job. She took an active interest in the reconstruction, pushing for practical improvements and personally championing the addition of what's now called the Truman balcony, a private porch overlooking the south lawn where the family could sit outside without being on public display. It is, in a strange way, the most on-brand architectural request imaginable, from a first lady who spent her entire tenure trying to carve out privacy inside a house that belonged, technically, to the entire country. Living at Blair House came with its own danger. On November 1, 1950, 2 Puerto Rican nationalists attempted to assassinate Truman there, in a shootout that killed one of his guards and wounded another. Truman was upstairs, napping before an afternoon appearance, and unharmed. Bess was elsewhere in the residence when the gunfire started. It's a reminder that the family's discomfort with public exposure was never simply about vanity or shyness. There were real stakes to being watched all the time, and occasionally, those stakes were lethal, and a woman who had spent her whole life trying to keep her family out of the public eye now had a very concrete, very literal reason to want the walls a little higher. The reconstruction itself dragged on for years and cost far more than anyone initially projected, gutting the interior down to the exterior stone walls and rebuilding the structure around a new steel frame. Bess toured the construction site periodically, and by most accounts took the disruption in stride better than Harry did, treating it as a practical problem to manage rather than a personal indignity. It's a small but telling contrast. The parts of the presidency that came with genuine physical risk or hard logistics, she handled without much visible strain. It was the performance of public affection and public scrutiny, the receiving lines and the press conferences, that wore on her. Then came 1948, and the campaign nobody thought Truman could win. Nearly every poll and every newspaper predicted Republican Thomas Dewey would beat him easily. Truman's response was an exhausting, cross-country whistle-stop train tour, dozens of stops, short speeches, delivered from the back platform of a rail car to whatever crowd had gathered at the station. And at the end of nearly every one of those speeches, Truman would introduce his wife and daughter to the crowd, calling Bess the boss and Margaret the boss's boss, a running joke that turned into one of the most memorable images of the campaign. Crowds loved it. It humanized a candidate the press had already written off, and historians generally credit the visible, close-knit image of the family fighting against long odds together as one real factor in Truman's shocking upset victory that November. It's worth sitting with the irony here. the single most politically effective public image of Bess Truman's entire life, the family on the train platform, waving, was built entirely around a woman who hated almost everything about being visible in that way. She did it because Harry needed her to, and because by that point in the marriage, needing each other in that specific, practical sense had become the whole shape of their partnership. The Trumans left the White House in January 1953 and went home to independence for good, back to the same house on Delaware Street where Bess had grown up and where her father had died 50 years earlier. In a detail biographers find genuinely surprising, Bess, who had spent 8 years trying to escape Washington whenever possible, apparently would have liked to keep a home there by the end of Harry's term. She had been firmly opposed to him seeking a second full term in 1952, telling him plainly that the stress of the presidency was taking a toll on his health he couldn't sustain, and on that point, she got her way. But leaving the capital for good, after finally building a life there, was more bittersweet than she'd expected. Retirement gave the marriage back its ordinary shape. Harry worked on his memoirs and the Truman Library. Bess ran the household on Delaware Street the way she always had, guarded her privacy fiercely, and largely stayed out of public commentary, though she did make one notable television appearance in 1951, a person-to-person interview she agreed to, mostly because Margaret pushed her into it. It remains one of the only extended glimpses of her actual personality that survives on film, dry, a little wry, clearly uncomfortable, and clearly enduring it anyway. Margaret's own career gave Bess one more brush with the ugly side of public life. Margaret pursued professional singing, and in 1950, a Washington Post critic named Paul Hume wrote a sharply negative review of one of her concerts. Harry, furious on his daughter's behalf, fired off a handwritten letter to Hume, threatening him, in language presidents generally don't put on paper. It became a minor national scandal, and it's a small but telling data point in this story. The family that guarded its privacy so carefully still had one member willing to blow it up completely the moment someone came after his daughter. Bess, for her part, stayed out of the public fight, as she stayed out of nearly all of them, though there's little doubt where her loyalties sat. Harry Truman died on December 26, 1972, after nearly 54 years of marriage. Bess outlived him by another decade, living quietly in the Delaware Street house, visited regularly by Margaret and her 4 grandsons. In 1965, years before Harry's death, President Lyndon Johnson traveled to that same house to sign Medicare into law and hand Harry the first card, a quiet nod to the health policy fight Truman had lost as president 2 decades earlier. Bess stood beside him for it, the same position she'd held at nearly every major moment of his career, present, watching, saying very little for the cameras. She died on October 18, 1982, at 97 years old, making her, at the time, the longest-lived First Lady in American history. Here's what's easy to miss if you only look at the official portraits and the polished biography book version of Bess Truman. She was not a woman who grew comfortable with political life over time, the way some reluctant spouses eventually do. She tolerated it, managed it, occasionally used it when it served the family, and never once stopped preferring the version of her life that stayed inside the walls of one house in Independence, Missouri. Her father's death gave her a permanent, well-earned wariness of exactly the kind of public exposure her husband's career required, and she spent 53 years of marriage managing that tension without ever fully resolving it. What she got, in exchange for decades of a life she didn't choose, was a level of genuine influence most first ladies of her era never had, a partnership built on being consulted rather than displayed, and, on the one occasion Harry left her out of a decision, the standing to be furious about it. It's not a romantic story in the way the whistle-stop photographs suggest. It's a more honest one. A woman who hated politics, married a man who couldn't live without it, and spent the rest of her life making sure that if the family had to live in the spotlight, at least the important decisions still got made at the kitchen table first. If you want more stories like this, the women who shaped the presidency's history barely credits them for, subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next one. And let me know in the comments, whose marriage should we cover next? Drop a name below.